Good afternoon, everybody. That's a little bit better. Welcome back from lunch. I hope everybody is feeling refreshed and recharged. My name is Sarah McGlagan. As Leslie mentioned, I will be your Master of Ceremony for this afternoon. But before I introduce our next session, I would once again like to thank Thales for sponsoring today's lunch. Now, building on this morning's excellent session, we will attempt to establish what competency-based assessment means to the licensing authority inspectors. Through an interactive exchange of ideas, we will identify similarities and differences and reach a common understanding of a security culture within the aviation context. To lead us into this discussion is Mr. Jim Dow, the Air Transport Representative to ICAO for the International Coordinating Council of Aerospace Industries Associations. Before that, Jim served for 4 years on the ICAO Air Navigation Commission following his nomination by Canada. A graduate of York University and the University of Toronto, Jim flew in the Royal Canadian Air Force in pilot training, search and rescue, and peacekeeping roles. After this, he taught aviation at Seneca College in Toronto, before joining the Transport Canada headquarters in Ottawa, where he became the Chief of Flight Training and Examinations. In addition to this, he's also the author of The Arrow, a book that examines the history of Aviation Canada Limited in 1959. The book itself, The Arrow, examines the history of Aviation Canada Limited from its formation in 1945 to the cancellation of the Arrow in 1959. So with that, please join me in welcoming Mr. Jim Dow to the lectern, please.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. I've spent yesterday in this audience. I spent this morning in this audience. I've concluded that we are a very good audience, and I think we are probably a competent audience, but you haven't been assessed. So we're going to assess you this session. And for those of you who are new to this room and new to ICAO, I'll tell you some secrets, all right? What are the observable behaviors we're looking for from you? One, are you paying attention? One. Over there on that wall, and over there on that wall, there are tracking cameras. And they can see you. And they can see whether you're paying attention. Now, our standard is quite proper. You can still work on your emails, because that would be called, young people call that multitasking, right? We old people used to call it not paying attention, but now it's called multitasking. But we're not using the tracking cameras today, but because you want to be an expert audience, I'll tell you to watch out for something. In the big meetings here, when they use the tracking cameras, and somebody chairing the meeting up here, the speakers list is created when you press your button at your microphone. And when it is your turn to speak, the light goes red on your microphone. You just don't want to sound like an idiot, but the tracking cameras will zoom in on you, okay? And then you will be on the screen up there. Everybody can see you. When that happens, don't look at the speaker. Look at the person sleeping behind the speaker, because that's what I find. People sleeping behind the speaker don't realize they're on the screen upstairs. So now you're becoming an expert audience. You can handle tracking cameras. There's another observable behavior. And that behavior will be the quality of your questions. This will be assessed. Now, I'll introduce the speakers, but my friend Henry is sitting right here. And Henry and I were on a panel together many years ago. And in the evening, when the rest of us were relaxing, maybe having a glass of wine or a beer, Henry kept working. And he was preparing for the next day. And he arrived the next day with all kinds of hard questions, every day. Henry was relentless. So, save some of your hard questions for Henry, please, all right? I think he needs some special treatment here. He can handle them. He's in the Secretariat. The other thing I want to call attention to here is We're talking about implementation of a new pilot license here at ICAO in the world standards in Annex 1. That's a big deal. This doesn't happen very often. It happened in 2006 when the multi-crew pilot license was introduced. I think before that, in the 80s, we took a license away. The senior commercial pilot license disappeared. But a new license is a big deal. But here's my test to remote pilots. Here's Jim's test for remote pilots. The first standard for a pilot license was established in 1919. And you can find it in the Convention for the Regulation of Aerial Navigation. And the license was called the Pilot's Flying Certificate for Flying Machines Used for the Purposes of Public Transport. Big name. There were no hours specified, but there were standards. And a series of tests you had to pass to get this license. So for the remote pilots, you have to pass this test. For this certificate in 1919, the examiner would show up and provide you with a map. When was the last time an examiner gave you anything? But they gave you a map. And you had to fly a cross-country flight. It was called a test of endurance. A cross-country or overseas flight of at least 300 kilometers. We're talking 1919 here now. 300 kilometers. You had to make that whole trip within 8 hours, and you had to come back in the same flying machine you left in. That was part of the standard. So for the remote pilots, the same flying machine you left in would be a perfect standard, and 300 kilometers is not bad. Now, I think there was also a requirement that you make 2 landings en route somewhere, so I'm not sure if we can do that, but we'll talk about that as the standard evolves. We're asking the question today, what does competency-based assessment mean to the licensing authority inspectors? That's a really important question, because if you want to succeed with implementing things, you want to make sure that the states can handle it, and the inspectors are trained to handle it. Industry depends on competent inspectors. Authorities depend on competent inspectors, and we're going to explore that question. First up, we're going to have Henry. Henry Defalque has 30 years of civil aviation experience, first as an airline pilot, with lots of experience there. Then he joined IATA, and he was on the panel that I was just talking about for IATA, and he joined ICAO in 2006. And there are other stories I could tell you about Henry, but I'll protect him because he's a good friend, and I won't tell you those stories now. But he's responsible for the Annex 1 matters, PADS training matters, Annex 6 matters related to certification and surveillance of airlines. So I have found Henry's counsel and advice always to be valuable here. So I'd like to bring him up here to the podium and have him talk to you. Please, Henry. There you go.
Thank you, Jim, and for the nice words. And good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to be speaking to you in this symposium. And I will have a short presentation. In this presentation, I would like to illustrate what impact competency-based training and assessment will have on the licensing authority and its inspectors. Right. The outline is as follows. We will first look at the differences between traditional training and competency-based training and assessment, or CBTA. Then we will look at how the CAA will exercise safety oversight of CBTA before drawing some conclusions. First, let us look at the differences between traditional training and CBTA. Traditional training is what we call qualification-based. i.e., the training aims at achieving or maintaining qualification requirements in Annex 1 or in the national regulations. These quantitative requirements can be considered as inputs that must be accounted for in the design of the training. And the training aims mainly at passing the final exams for which testing criteria are established by the CAA. So the training is developed for that. For inspectors approving such programs, it is a tick box approach. Every requirement is fulfilled. Competency-based training provides, on the other hand, an integrated approach to achieve the desired outcome. That is, to develop the competencies to be safe, highly effective, and efficient in the performance of the job. The training development is much more complex and normally calls for course developers' experience in CBTA. PANS training contains, you have heard this morning, a methodology to develop a CBTA program based on a series of sequential steps. Conduct a training needs analysis, define an adapted competency model, design training and assessment plans before developing the course material. As CBTA demands an integrated learning that is providing the knowledge just when necessary to practice a skill. And as it also demands continuous assessments of the trainees, a learning management system, or LMS, is a tool that is most helpful for those training organizations. LMS provides many features that help the ATO, approved training organization. Courseware control, documentation and record keeping, student and instructor performance monitoring, course progression tracking, standardization of delivery, and very important data analysis that provides feedback to improve the training. So these are the differences. We can illustrate these with this slide. On the left side is the description of CBTA, while on the right side is the description of qualification-based training. I'll leave you a couple of seconds to read the text, if you can. And then let us look at the CAA oversight of CBTA for the remote pilot license. For the CAA overseeing CBTA, that implies a large regulatory effort to develop the framework for the license, for the conduct of the training in CBTA, and for prescribing the ATO duties and roles. But the CAA must also produce much guidance for its personnel and for the ATO, covering the criteria for the issue of the remote pilot license, how to design CBTA for the remote pilot license, how to conduct CBTA and the final assessment of trainees, and what are the qualifications of those involved in the training, whether they are instructors, examiners, or inspectors. It must also provide the inspector procedures handbook for approving and exercising surveillance of the training organization, approved training organizations, and their CBTA training. And the guidance must also cover how to qualify the flight simulation training devices. And here we have a problem. There is no ICAO guidance for those criteria. Now, if we look at the inspectors not familiar with CBTA, they will need much specific training to be qualified in the oversight of competency-based training and assessment. And the training must cover the understanding of the RPL itself, the license, and of RPAS operations. And for those who will be examiners, the qualification on RPAS. Then CBTA principles in PANS training, you have heard about them, the generic methodology, the ICAO competency framework for the license, adapted competency model, including performance criteria. And again, the inspector must be trained in understanding and knowing the regulations on the license and on the CBTA for the license. They must be trained to understand and use properly the CA guidance material. They will also need to be trained for the approval of CBTA training programs, approval of the competency, the adapted competency model, approval of training and assessment plan, approval or, let's say, inspection of the conduct of training, and approval of the course evaluation by the ATO. They must also be trained for the approval of qualification of the CBTA instructors and the designated examiners. All that requires on-the-job training. Once qualified, the inspector duties will include approve the CBTA training for the remote pilot license, including the approval of the adapted competency model, that's a very critical part, and approval of the training and assessment plans. And finally, they need to conduct inspection of actual conduct of CBTA by the training organization. They will have to approve the qualification programs for the instructors and for the designated examiners. And that is a very different program than the qualification for traditional program instructors and examiners. And then they must qualify the flight simulation training devices and approve the remote piloted aircraft and the remote pilot station for use for training if applicable. And there may be a need to initially approve a CBTA course for a proof of concept trial, after which the inspector will look at the result, ensure that the graduates meet the final performance criteria of the competency model, and the training is achieving the intended outcome. And that is the outcome intended both by the ATO but also by the authority, before they can approve the training program for a longer term. Afterwards, the inspector will conduct surveillance of the training organization and its training program, and that is very important, monitor the performance of the graduates on their job. We can draw a few conclusions on that. First, it is really a good progress. A new CBTA approach has been created for the remote pilot license that will allow all these various different operations and various different aircraft type to be covered by one license. And the burden for the CAA is high in terms of both regulation, new regulations, and producing guidance material. The inspector training is paramount and significant because CBTA is a new domain for them generally. And the inspector will find it more complex than to oversee traditional training. It's not a tick box approach. Each ATO adapted competency model is different. There is no one size fits all, and performance criteria are different for each training program. There is a lack of ICAO criteria for the qualification of the flight simulation training devices that will be used in the training. And the ongoing surveillance implies that the inspector has a good understanding of the adapted competency model developed and used by each approved training organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. We're going to turn now to Farid Zizi. You know Farid. He's been with you all morning. I don't feel like I have to introduce him, but I have to tell a story about him. When was it? 2011. The commission was on a trip to Toulouse, and we visited with Farid helping us the École Nationale de l'Aviation Civile, the ANAC. And what I remember of that visit is a couple of things. Is to see him in his natural habitat. He's such a passionate educator and trainer, and to see him among young people, to see him in that setting of ANAC, helped me really understand a lot about Farid. And my background is in education and training as well, and maybe we share that in common. The other thing I remember, and Farid probably doesn't remember this, but we got on the bus and we were heading back to the airport. And he was at the front of the bus, and I think I might have been at the back, and he jumped up and pointed at an airport over there, and he said, Saint-Exupéry had flown from that airport. And he knew that I just love Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, the books like Vol de Nuit and Pilote de Guerre, and of course, Le Petit Prince. So it was really a wonderful thing that you did, Farid, to point that out to me, that this was a place where this famous aviator had flown. But you already know Farid because he's been moderating already. You know that he was at ANAC, and he had very great responsibilities for many years. You know that he was on the Air Navigation Commission from 2010, and he was president of the commission for 3 years as well, which is a tough assignment. But just as I asked you of Henry, that he can handle hard questions. Farid asked a lot of hard questions too in the commission, so you can give him some back, and you can ask hard questions for him too. Farid, please.
Thank you, Jim. No, I'm not so. That's the reason I left the commission, is not to get any hard questions anymore. And the good example is the title of my presentation. The question of the session was about licensing authority inspectors. And I transformed it to licensing authority only to make it easy. But because before the competency of the licensing inspectors, we need some in the licensing authority. And that's one of the challenges of the CBT also. And as the question came this morning about the experience we should have to look at competency-based training, it's clear that let's say in the operational world, you get already an experience because you plan your operations, you understand what you want to do, as simple as that. So you can address a number of things. Seen by the authority is not so obvious with the variety of things that you have to look at. So I will try to capture big pictures. As you understood already this morning, I'm not able to go in details because I don't understand so much. So I will only stay at a certain level. And the first level I went to is, okay, what's the level? What's the role of the licensing authority? And since my friend Henri is beside me, I looked in the Annex 1. as simple as that. And then I looked at the definitions and then the various rules. Assessment of an applicant's qualifications to hold the license or rating. Could be difficult, but if you have an agreed framework that you master, on my opinion, it doesn't change too much. It doesn't challenge you. Issue an endorsement of licenses and rating is more or less the same, except that you have to adapt your licensing schemes and ratings to the potentially variety of operations that you are dealing with. What is more difficult is designate and authorized approved persons, which would mean that you would be competent yourself. Approval of training courses, approval of training facilities. As I look at it, it looks very challenging. And it perhaps looks challenging because we don't have yet so much experience. But it's the same with every new subject. One of the difficulties of aviation is that aviation did evolve in a very progressive manner with not so many subjects, new subjects, let's say. And then the other ones, validation of licenses issued by other contracting states. Not so difficult if you have a common framework. And that's one of the added value of ICAO. Bringing you with a competency-based framework, which is flexible enough to adapt to your own reality, but is a common reference also to do some either bilateral or other type of work, but this validation of licenses across boundaries. Let's go back to my drawings that you already understood very clearly this morning. Okay, and I am an ATO. I want to become an approved training organization. What do? I do address the profession, the jobs. I do my job and task analysis. I identify my operational challenges. I have my competency and performance framework. Either it is coming directly from ICAO or from a regional organization, or my authority has given me something to deal with. Where is the authority key? Is in approving with the ATO the training objectives. What skills, what competencies does the authority have for that? Not so much. No real operational experience. Hopefully, no accident yet. In aviation, we take a lot of experience from safety events, incidents, accidents. But we cannot, in our RPAS SUAS question, deal and accept that those occurrences would be. But perhaps the first things we would have to do is to be capable to collect, let's say, near incidents before they develop a bit more. And then I need to assess the delivery of the training, either just after delivery or even during operational life. The big questions. It's not the competency-based framework, because you understood this morning that it is easy to develop some. The big question is to assess the performance and to understand the performance, knowing that in our times, the licensing authority is very often delegating to the training organizations a number of things. The licensing authority doesn't pretend anymore to be more competent than the training organization. What they do is that they work together, they accept a common methodology, they accept the conditions of delivering training, but not necessarily the exact content of it. So, but my authority needs stability and is there to frame things. And as I said this morning, is there to ensure to the public that safety is controlled. And the licensing scheme should adapt to the variety of situations, a common set of expected behaviors, and also some flexibility in the level of taxonomy, the necessity to appreciate the context, etc., etc. So for me, as an authority, it's becoming a nightmare. Because if I have to address all the variety of things that may happen on my territory, I have a big problem. If then I do want, like it is the case of a number of national administrations, want to develop the economic growth which is provided by the US and the variety of people that are going in this industry, I have to be really careful. In some way, I have to be flexible enough to adapt to that variety, and in some way, I have to ensure the stable and safe environment which is provided by the regulatory and the competency that serves that regulatory framework. One of the big difficulties I have is in approving the training organizations and the facilities, especially after what I said this morning. The key competencies for me are the situation awareness. And this morning we had very nice presentations from operators that were dealing with a mission. In none of the presentations this morning, they did too much discuss the environment, the airspace environment of the mission. You can have a very evolved RPAS system which is flying in a non-so-evolved manned aviation world. The question is not what you have in the RPAS system, the question is when they meet together, how does it work? But for me, as a licensing authority looking at my ATO, I can discuss it, how I make sure that this is clearly understood and conveyed to the students, or the trainees, I should say trainees. They are not all so young. And I think it's important. The second thing, which is very important for me, is the non-usual situation, and in which the C2 link loss is, of course, the typical case. That you can teach. What you will not teach how to technically react easily to a C2 link loss, because normally it's Ed this morning that said we have to make simulation of emergency situations. Being an engineer myself, what you can simulate is always something that the engineer has already thought about. But what you will face as a real difficult operational situation is what the engineer didn't envisage. And the simulation can envisage things that the engineer has envisaged, but the things that you didn't envisage cannot be so easily simulated. For me, games would be the tool. But you have to address that, especially if you say, which is my purpose personally, that it is a key competency. And then the third one is airspace, understanding of the operational context. I am here not on the inspector. I am here on this agreement, which is key in competency-based training, which is in between the training operator, the operational life, or the operators, the clients of the training provider, and the administration. And to make sure that this works, they have to understand themselves. And only then you will come to another question, which is the instructor abilities. Something which is important and that we will perhaps have to look at, which is not so difficult in our common world in ATM or pilot, is the oversight. And for me, the oversight is a combination of the approved training provider, but also the operators of oversight. Because to judge the production of the training, you have to look at the operations. And you have to ingest in your organization this capacity of the feedback, the return of experience process. And this will be especially key in the case of RPAS, because we are all learning in running. And we need to ingest, to put that in our system. So I described the nightmare. I have a proposal. One proposal, it's very easy for the licensing authority, and it's beginning to shape in the regulatory environment. It's what I call the scenario approach. So you simply reduce the number of variables that you have to deal with. That's what we have done in France with the small UAS, defining a number of scenarios, and you define your training requirements towards those scenarios, and that, as a licensing authority, you know well, because you have defined it, which is also interesting for the training provider, because he can refer to those scenarios, and it's the same for the operator. So this is a really good asset to create that agreement in between the three actors that I just mentioned. So those are the descriptions. I will not enter in the details. You will have the slides afterward. But of the French scenarios for small UAS, what is important is that you define your scenarios with a number of characteristics, but also a level of risk and safety. And then you can address, using a common competency-based framework, what would be key in this competency, even the level of taxonomy or performance you are expecting in the detailed competency. And presently we do it for regulatory development. I think it's also a good asset for the training. And then you will jump in the practice of your training, the theory you need, the practical aspects you need, perhaps the tools you impose on your ATO, and also this will be a reference for the training of the inspectors and the trainings of all who are concerned with the training scheme, more or less. So I will not go in the details, you will find them. And what is important, sorry, it's not yet merci, it's with those scenarios, you can address a level of variety that you can control and master. You can keep the flexibility in the system, and those scenarios are supporting tools. They are not regulation by such, because what is important as a licensing authority is that you don't over-regulate. We should leave a level of flexibility to the evolution, and especially if you did develop sufficiently your feedback loop from the operations. And I'd like to finish my presentation on this because, on my opinion, this is key. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Farid. Australians have a real impact around here because they keep showing up at meetings. On the Flight Crew Licensing and Training panel, we were chaired by an Australian, and now we're going to go to Jim Coyne. Now, Jim is going to moderate your next session, so this is important. I'll introduce him here, and this will count for maybe the introduction for the next time, too. Jim holds a Bachelor of Engineering with honors in Electronics and Communications from Queensland University of Technology in Australia, and a Master of Science in Aerosystems Engineering from Loughborough University in the United Kingdom. He was the Australian member and the former co-chair of the ICAO UASSG, the Unmanned Aircraft Systems Study Group, from 2009 until 2014. That's where I would have first met you, Jim, in that study group work. He retired from CASA in 2014. He now works as the technical director for UAS International, and he recently wrote a book titled Drones in Society, Exploring the Strange New World of Unmanned Aircraft, which was published in December 2016. Jim, we should have had you set up outside to be signing copies of your book. You missed an opportunity here. Jim, please.
Thanks, Jim. Yes, as Jim said, I retired 3 years ago, and you know, what does one do when one retires? One writes a book. But there's an old adage that says everybody's got a book in them, but most times that's where it should stay. Okay, so I'm really fortunate that I followed Henry and my good friend Farid, because they've done all the work for me. So my presentation will be about 3 minutes long. So I just want to go through what is competency. So we talked about this morning in terms of what competency is. So I just want to sort of revisit that, I guess. The position of a remote pilot has a specific set of competencies required to fly an RPA effectively and safely. And the beauty of having a set of competencies is that it focuses not on what the person can do, but on what the person can learn. Competency also includes motivation and self-knowledge, and a desire and a willingness to demonstrate effective performance. So we can define competency as a set of individual performance behaviors that are observable, measurable, and critical to successful performance of the remote pilot and, in turn, the organization. So going further, what is competency-based assessment? So the use of competencies to assess remote pilots can help to define and understand the knowledge and skills required to operate an RPA effectively and safely. Evaluating a remote pilot's performance based on predefined competencies and the behavioral indicators is thus called competency-based assessment. That assessment is the process of collecting evidence and making judgments on whatever competency has been achieved. The purpose for assessment is to confirm that an individual can perform the standard expected of a remote pilot as expressed in the approved competency standards. Now, not everybody likes CBT. We're all speaking to the converted here, probably, that everybody likes it, but not everybody does. There's a lot of people who do think that the opponents to it consider that it's narrow and rigid and theoretically unsound. So you will come across, if you're in the training world, you will come across people who are opposed to CBT. So let's look at the traditional versus the competency-based learning. The traditional, I call it the work-based learning. Henry called it qualification-based. This enables individuals to learn directly from the work they do. Participants learn directly through doing the job. It's self-paced learning, formal training sessions, and on-the-job visits. This could be any trade training, a carpenter, mechanic. They're the type of people that are doing that work-based training. Competency-based learning allows the learners to move at their own pace. The person is assessed against standard criteria. The learning is evidence-based over time. It's participatory for both the learner and the assessor, and it may include role plays and or simulations. And if the person doesn't attain the necessary competency, there is the capacity for retraining and reassessment. So it's a circular process that they can go through. So if we then look at the competency-based assessment with those two, the traditional and the competency-based methods. So the traditional, that's generally a one-off observation for to accessibility. It doesn't demonstrate that the action is repeatable. The student may fumble. As managers, a lot of you probably have had people come into you to do interviews for a job, and you know that they're very competent, and they fumble, they can't find the words, they can't express themselves, and the same thing with doing a job. You know, you can fumble it. If you're a mechanic, you can drop your tool, or you can drop your trowel if you're doing a bricklayer or whatever. So, or you can fluke it on the day. So it's not repeatable. It's a simple pass-fail, and that's it. With competency-based, it's multi-dimensional. It breaks the job into many components to allow for deeper analysis. It provides a rating assessment, and you can have as many as you want: excellent, very good, good, poor. And it provides an overall assessment for each item: competent versus not yet competent. Not a pass or a fail, not a good or a bad. It's competent, you can do the job, or we can just keep going around that same circular path. But what does that all mean for the inspector? The inspector needs to understand what CBT is. They have to be competent. They need to understand what CBT assessment is. They need to understand the competency standards that are being used. They need to audit the training organizations rather than assessing individual remote pilots. Many training organizations produce many remote pilots, and the regulatory authorities have limited resources, i.e. only a few inspectors. We heard yesterday that the FAA has 61,000 remote pilots. I'll bet you they don't have anywhere, it wouldn't have a tenth of that in terms of the inspectors. So in answering the question, what does competency-based assessment mean to the licensing authority inspectors, their job is far more complex. That was it.
Thank you, Jim. Your book is longer than that, right? This whole question of traditional versus competency-based, I manage the pilot training section in Transport Canada, and here's an example of traditional. If you look at the ICAO Annex 1, provisions for the instrument rating. Instrument rating sets out certain requirements, but it leans heavily, as they all do, on hours. You have to have 40 hours of instrument time. It breaks it down, but basically, if you examine how you can meet that standard, and we issued instrument ratings to pilots in Canada that could do this, you could do every one of those 40 hours on a day like today, which was sunny and clear, and never ever see the inside of a cloud. You could actually have your flight test on the same kind of a day and never see the inside of a cloud. And to make matters even worse, it didn't happen very often, but you could have the examiner role-playing the controller, so you never actually interacted with a real air traffic controller. And you can wind up with a rating that is very powerful without having been exposed to the conditions under which you're going to use that rating. It reminded me of my first instrument rating in the Air Force when the wing commander gave me the card and he said it was a blue card, the instrument rating. And he said you can take that card and stick it up on the window, and when the sky is the same color as that card, you can go flying, instrument flying, right? Because he wanted me to get some experience in clouds and in real weather before they would upgrade me to the full license. So traditional training heavily leans on hours of exposure. and that can take you to a certain, and it's the appropriate solution for some kinds of training. But if you're going to invoke a systems methodology, which is very powerful, and I disagree with those people who disagree with CBT, by the way. So all to say, thank you, Jim. That was a stimulating conversation. Wimen is here. Wimen Fong. I'm really glad she's here, too, because she's the legal advisor to the Central American Agency for Aviation Safety, which is ACSA, which is a regional safety oversight organization. And that's a really important idea, a regional safety oversight. I think the world needs a lot more cooperation and a lot less conflict. And this is an example of cooperation. So that regional safety oversight organization exists within another structure called COCESNA, which is the Central American Corporation for Air Navigation Services. COCESNA is a really interesting organization to me, because this is coming together of countries. We've got Costa Rica, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua in 1960. They joined together. And then I think in 1966, Belize joins as well. So you have a really interesting collaboration, cooperation, working together, because implementing ICAO standards is not easy. Working together, sharing resources, working together is the way to go. So we have Wimen here. She's a legal advisor for the ACSA, which is a branch of COCESNA. She was a former attorney with the Civil Aviation Authority of Costa Rica, where she was part of the study group that developed the RPAS framework for that country. In ACSA, she provides legal assistance to the Competency-based Training and Assessment Program, and she also reviews the legal content of the harmonization of regional standards and develops regional agreements, among other functions. Wimen, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. I'm very honored and pleased to be here today. As Jim told you, the Central American Corporation for Air Navigation Services, COCESNA, is an integration organism that recommends, guides, and facilitates the state members in response to the ICAO requirements. It achieves the fulfillment of the obligations of the states due to the Chicago Convention, attaining scale economies, and of course the general well-being of the fulfillment of that the obligations give. It is important to mention that COCESNA has 3 branches. First, Central American Agency for Air Navigation Service, ACNA. The second, Central American Aeronautical Training Institute, which is ICAO, and last but not least, Central American Agency for Aviation Safety, ACSA, which is the regional safety oversight organization that Jim mentioned. And we develop regional harmonization of standards and procedures, leading to mutual recognition of licenses, and it's currently working on developing regional standards and procedures on RPAS. So today I'm going to talk about competency-based assessment for licensing authority and building competency within the licensing authority. The content of this presentation is going to be why competency-based training, the inspectors' new competencies, the regional challenges and achievements. Okay, so why competency training? So the training was based, as my partners told you, the training was based on theoretical aspects, meaning that the inspectors were taught in a traditional way, learning the concepts, the rules, and the procedures, but there was something that was still missing, something that would allow them to apply adequately what they had learned. The regional inspectors applied different criteria during the assessment, certification processes, and licensing emissions, being that the stakeholders were affected due to duplication of procedures, elevated costs for industry, among others. The competency framework consists on competency units, elements, performance criteria, evidence and assessment guide, and other variables. With the training standardization, we're searching for homogeneous application of criteria between inspectors while they're performing their tasks. So the approach for the inspector training has been mostly based on the requirements, on SOL requirements, and it's very prescriptive. And the require approach emphasizes the documentation and the program review of the means of measure operational safety. So what were the inspector requirements? Licensing, experience, and training. So we noticed that the training given was not really enough. There was still a difference while applying the rules, and the procedure were not followed. So the new competency-based training methodology introduces us to what was missing. So it was competency. It was just not about the fundamentals or the theory, but check that the inspector really has not only the abilities, but the competency to fulfill his tasks. The training program must evolve as the RPAS environment is evolving at a very fast pace. A better understanding and analysis of this environment and competencies will make the program more efficient and more effective. So were the inspectors prepared to carry out their tasks? What's missing? Okay, so by monitoring the competencies, we can identify the inspector deficiencies. This way, we can reinforce and determine the elements that require our utmost attention. So, for example, in terms of general aviation knowledge, the normal theory courses make no mention on RPAS, and the aircraft theory can be irrelevant to modern RPAS. How to certify or approve an RPAS training organization to deliver any aviation at all? So let's check on the RPAS inspector's new competencies. Okay, so for ACSA, the inspector competency training should be developed in several steps. Hold on. Okay, I'm sorry. The framework and the training. The competency framework, it's an effective method to assess and maintain and monitor the KS, and the review of the current inspector training program to incorporate the competency-based training and assessment methodology. And that way the inspectors will be trained in the performance orientation and will emphasize the standards of performance and measurement. So for ACSA, the inspector competency should be developed in several steps. It's a 5 training steps, in which for phase 1, we have the selection process. It is important for ACSA to choose the personnel according to the activities identified within the organization. The inspector proves to be proficient in all areas assessed. And on phase 2, the initial training is defined in 2 parts: basic training and qualification training modules, which the inspector will move to the OGT phase, where he or she will demonstrate what has been learned. Phase 3 is the OGT training, which is performed as site-specific, practical, and on-job training. Phase 4, which is the continuous training. It's designed to maintain competencies through refresher, emergency, and conversion training. And phase 5 is the progressive training, which consists on developing additional competencies required by change or by evolution. So as for the regional challenges and achievements, the RPAS competency using the 5 steps program that we have developed, the regional training will focus on competency and the inspectors will have achieved these standards. So to be competent, the regional and national inspectors will need to demonstrate the ability to perform the task and the duties that the standards expected in order to be in order to carry out his obligations. So the regional inspector's achievements are measured against competency standards rather than against the achievement of other inspectors. Inspectors must develop competencies such as problem solving, critical thinking, and initiative that will enable to manage any situation that they have to deal with, even if it's not specifically during their training. That's why the current training programs are under revision right now. So let's speak about benefits of a regional regulation and the training program, and which is basically the harmonization of certification and surveillance programs to supervise the RPAS operations, and this will facilitate the operations to train their pilots with the benefit of regional license recognition. This way, having all the inspectors trained in the same terms will allow them to assess based on the same standards and procedures, applying their harmonized and equal way. ACSA is working closely with the states and the industry to develop the training standard syllabus and resources necessary for the industry to expand and grow professionally. Okay, as far as the achievements for the region, the inspectors of the region are trained based on a standardized training program, which has led to an optimization of resources in terms of training, instructors, cost, among others. For example, the new training program developed under the CBT methodology includes basic, advanced, and recurrent training. All of them are based on the inspector competencies, determining the KAS knowledges of the trainee. We are in the process to introduce the new licensing inspectors' competencies regarding RPAS. So being in this panel has given us a hint toward other areas taking under consideration this methodology. 5 or 6 years ago, licensing authorities had to comply with a checklist. Now they have to take a CBT approach under consideration on a daily basis, which is a more flexible approach. This effort will help standardize Central American authorities, training, optimizing the resources. So we can basically conclude as the main achievements for the region a standardized inspectors training program. 3 programs have already been reviewed and will be running out next year, which is licensing, airworthiness, and air navigation services, the optimization of resources, and common rules and procedures for a harmonized enforcement. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Wimen. Very good. This is her first visit to ICAO, and I'm so excited to see people coming here for the first time. Gave her a little tour yesterday. Now, we asked the question, what does competency-based assessment mean to the licensing authority inspectors? Your turn is now to start asking questions, and I'll come to you in a moment, but we've explored these questions with Henry, with Farid, with Jim, with Wimen, and combined, I keep hearing a lot about systems, instructional system design, learning management systems, training management systems, safety management systems, I guess, come into view because you have to be an approved training organization, correct? And that means Annex 19 comes into view and you have to have safety management systems. This is a lot of systems going on around here, and it means a systematic method of training, which we know works. Now, I'd like to turn to you. Tracking cameras are off. You're not going to be showing there, but if you could just put up your hand, and when you press your microphone button, you'll see the ring will turn red. That means your microphone is live. Just tell us who you are, and then ask your question. But we'll direct the questions to our panel, our group here. So is there anybody who wants to take the first question? I'm looking for a hand up there. We have one over here, sir.
Good afternoon. Now you can hear me. Thank you. My name is Steve George, and my question is related to the concept of situational awareness, which we've heard a lot about both yesterday and today. Situational awareness is a concept advocated as an essential, if not critical, component to safety, which is provided to a remote pilot from various displays and sources of information. I'm curious as to what the panelists' views and your expert areas of expertise on how this essential pilot competency would be trained, measured, demonstrated, and assessed in the context of competency. And should it continue to be promulgated as such a critical pilot function and competency if it cannot? Thank you.
It's indeed a difficult question. However, we cannot avoid to discuss it because the essential risk is really in between the flying RPA and the surrounding environment, whatever it is. In an urban environment might be buildings, in an airspace, other airspace users, etc., etc. There are ways. In ENAC, we developed, for example, a long time ago, the capacity to connect flight simulators and ATM simulators. So you can provide, you can be in your remote pilot station simulated with an airspace around you simulated also. It can be done. Also on a few CBTs where you create a situation, and then you CBT, computer-based training in that case, where you create a situation and then you force to think about, okay, what are the hypotheses? How do I react? How do I prevent a number of things? So what is important is to go out of, I am piloting my aircraft. I have to anticipate of what is around and how the environment will react. A number of UAS will be more advanced in the automation and the flying dynamics or the control of the flight than the manned aviation itself. The problem is how they interact. And that has to be drilled. It doesn't mean that you will know things, but if you can ask yourself the right questions, prepare properly the missions as we said this morning, and then be aware of what could happen. And then obviously we are all developing around UTM and other concepts that may also provide the necessary information to share a bit. Then obviously you can train for that.
Just following on from that, I think it's like a question that was asked this morning in one of the earlier panels. I think situational awareness is one of those soft or non-technical skills, the soft skills. We all talk about the technical and the operational aspects of what we do. I'm an engineer. Engineers, pilots. That's the way that we talk. That's the way we sort of try to think that that's the more important ones. But when you come to the non-technical skills or the soft skills, as we call them, which situational awareness is such, it's a different set of competencies that the person has to have to assess them. Now, and I think Steve, you remember, I mean, during the ICAO Unmanned Aircraft Systems Study Group, we talked about those human performance and the human factors. And I've always claimed that you can't bolt that on at the end of your regulation or your standards development. You've got to include that as you move along so that you pick up all those soft skills as part of the hard skills that you're having. So by the time you finish with it, you've got the whole package, and you're not trying to figure out what you haven't done throughout the whole development. So I think it is very difficult. I'm not a human factors or a human performance person, but there are people around, and you need to have those part of your group to be able to make those judgments and those assessments.
Thank you. And I believe that we consider situational awareness to be a competency, and we have currently in evidence-based training in the manual on evidence-based training, we have observable behaviors for that, which allow you to measure whether the person is aware of the situation, and these are the measures. And that means they can be trained, because if you detect that the person is lacking in situational awareness, you can improve the competency by training. And so as long as you have observable behaviors, you can measure that. Thank you.
Yeah, I would also add that you have a situation awareness. In fact, the combination for RPL is the combination of the situation awareness that you find in the PANS training for controllers and the combination of situation awareness that you find for the EBT. If you take the two, you have already a bunch of things.
Okay, I'm going to demonstrate my situational awareness. We have about 8 minutes left, and sir, you have a question.
There we go. This must be kangaroo corner here because I'm amongst a lot of Australians, so I apologise for the accent. I've been in the training environment for almost 40 years, but one of the things that strikes me about training regulators and their inspectorate for the task at hand is both the cost and the time factor involved in doing so. So obviously they're critical. We've seen the graphs on the exponential growth of RPAS and UAS within the environment. The experience when I was with the Australian regulator when we introduced system safety inspectors is that we realised that we had to have a different type of competency for the inspectorate. Just because we had experienced airworthiness inspectors, flying operations inspectors, there was a different type of competency for assessing systems-based audits as opposed to product audits. A lot of our people were very good at doing product audit. It didn't necessarily mean they were competent to be able to do systems-based audit. That's an example, but I just hope that the regulators don't automatically think that the best people to do the inspection are necessarily the people that the inspectors there now. You mentioned the fact that situational awareness is a competency. Well, that's very true. And maybe there's air traffic controllers or retired air traffic controllers or ATC people that lost licence due to medicals may be more ideally suited to be inspectorates of RPAS and UAS. Just something for consideration.
Okay, we do it both. Fully agree. Fully agree. On my opinion, air traffic controllers are well prepared to assess this question of situation awareness, where they are perhaps not prepared for other things. And then the question is how you organize yourself. Perhaps it's not a one inspector. It's perhaps when you evaluate the training programs, you may evaluate it considering various competencies that are brought by the various persons that you have in your system. But obviously, it shall be a number of people having this aviation awareness, I will call it like that, not only the automat awareness.
You know, I agree too, another Aussie. But I think most time, I mean, we're moving into a whole new world of within the unmanned aircraft, and the competency-based training that's coming out now, training the remote pilots, it is different. The inspectors within the regulatory authority are not actually assessing them. They're not even seeing them. They're getting they get a recommendation from the registered training organisation saying this person is competent, issue the licence. So the regulator doesn't even see them. They don't get to watch them fly. Now, the person that's going to issue that licence has got to have a lot of trust in the RTO to begin with, that they're doing the job properly. So they need to have very special skills. And I would agree with you. I don't think a lot of them have that. The regulators employ people and they ask them in the interview, can you assess CBT? Yeah, of course I can. Good, you got the job. That's not the way you should do it. So I think it is a problem.
Thank you. I just want to come out of the RPAS world and talk about inspectors in general. We have found at ICAO that is a weak point in many regulators, and so it was stressed that we needed to provide a bit more guidance on the training of inspectors. So we published last year, or I think it was last year or at the beginning of this year, a new manual on the qualification of civil aviation safety inspectors that details the training, details the career progression, details the competency framework for inspectors. Now that needs to be implemented, but we hope that over the years it will improve the system. Thank you.
So as far for Central America, that is also an approach that we do have. That is part of the review that is being taken under the programs for the inspectors, not only on RPAS, but also on other inspectors on other areas also.
Thank you for that question. Sir, over there.
Hi, yes, my name's David Walters from Consortic. We provide training as an NQE over in the UK, but the question I have is with the competency-based training and progressive training after the licensing, is there any review of flight log data to look at pilot flying standards, look at the flight modes that they're actually flying in, the hours of those flight modes that they're flying in, and the functionalities that they might be using? Are they trained to use specific functions within the RPAS system that maybe they're using when they shouldn't be, but also the overuse of emergency features such as return to home, which with these smart-based systems we're seeing an overuse of when necessarily they shouldn't be used?
I'm not quite sure I understood your question, but what I understood was that we talked today about getting a license through competency-based training, and you are looking at after you get the license, what do you do? I think the competencies that under which you were trained, for which you were trained, are still valid on the job, and the feedback from the job on the job performance should at least be a feedback taken into account to adapt even further the competency model. But the graduates of a training organization are going to practice the trade, and they should improve their competencies as they continue recurrent training or on-the-line training, or even performing their job. They should know which competencies they have, and they need to improve.
Yeah, if you look at the competency-based framework, you will find a number of things. Two essentials. One is the generic competency, and the second one are the observable behaviors. The observable behaviors, you will decide at some point that it is your competency-based framework, and you will decide the level of of expectations you have. What is important, especially because the operational life doesn't offer you exactly what you were always expecting, is to be capable to modify using the operational experience. Obviously not waiting for too much incidents, which make it an obligation to change. But this is really the process.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think we'll stop the questions there. We have many other questions, Farid, but we also have time for a break right now, which can be explored one-on-one with the people here. What we've been exploring is, of course, what does it mean to the licensing inspector? What does it mean to the authority? And I think we've explored that question. For you, I told you you would be assessed by the quality of your questions. Well, I've checked the questions I had. Your questions were much better than my questions, so you've passed on that test. The final judgment will come on the next symposium. I'm not sure when the next symposium will be held, but maybe it will be interpreted, in which case that will be your real test. When you work through the interpreters in the back and have to wear the earpieces too, that'll be your final test. But for now, Sarah, I'm going to give this back to you.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you for moderating. Thank you for also bringing a sense of humor today. Thank you to our panelists for adding a very interesting angle to today's theme. And with that, I think it's time for a coffee break. So with that, we would ask you to kindly return back to the Assembly Hall by 4 o'clock. And for those moderator and panelists, we ask you to return 5 minutes to 4. Thank you.